LinkedIn presents.
A lot of people make a lot of assumptions about obsessive compulsive disorder. What do we really know? I'm Maura Aarons-Mele, and this is The Anxious Achiever, the show that looks at the intersection of mental health and work and asks, how can we do both better?
Forward thinkers know that when people thrive, organizations thrive. This is the future of work. This is Workday, the AI platform that elevates humans.
From LinkedIn News, I'm Jessie Hempel, host of the Hello Monday podcast. Start your week with the Hello Monday podcast. We'll navigate career pivots. We'll learn where happiness fits in. Listen to Hello Monday with me, Jessie Hempel, on the LinkedIn Podcast Network or wherever you get your podcasts.
Understanding more about mental health challenges, whether they're your own or those of the people you work with or the people that you care about, makes us better people and leaders. And today, we'll be talking about the latest understanding of obsessive compulsive disorder, or OCD. There's the pop culture version of OCD. Maybe a quirky sitcom character who has to wash their hands all the time, annoys their roommates. And then there's the reality. Michael Alcee is a psychotherapist with expertise in a number of areas, but today we'll have him here to talk about OCD and what he's learned in working with patients. He's the author of the book, The Upside of OCD, Flip the Script to Reclaim Your Life. Alcee argues there's a lot of wisdom and creativity that lives within anxiety that should never be discarded, and OCD is no different. We'll also talk about the symptoms and treatments of OCD and how it plays out in day-to-day life. Here's our conversation. One of the things that I love so much is that you ask us to think of OCD as a frenemy, which I thought was just perfect. Like, why should we think of OCD as a frenemy if we have it?
Well, it's so funny. We're so used to it as being talked about it as an enemy. Even as a psychologist, I'll say that, right? Mm-hmm. Even psychologists want to, even no CD, like you want to get rid of your OCD. It's a terrible thing. But there's a hidden messenger sort of along the lines of, Rumi and the guest house, right? Be careful. This guest might kind of sweep you over your house, but it might be a wise guide from beyond. Mm-hmm. And as in most of anxieties, one of the reasons I sort of love your work about anxiety is that there's so much wisdom and creativity and feeling within anxiety that should never be discarded. So there's something about that tension that I think is really crucial about creativity and really integrating as a person with OCD.
Of course, you know what I'm going to say next, which is what people say to me all the time. Where the hell do you get off telling me this thing that's ruining my life is a frenemy?
Oh, completely. And that's why it's so funny. Like even people, when they hear the title, The Upside of OCD, like, how dare you?
Yeah.
And it's really a misnomer in a way. It's really like writing a political slogan, as you probably know from your background. It's hard to have a political slogan that's really long. And so it wouldn't make sense to be like the upside of not really OCD, but what comes before OCD and is in you, even though you develop OCD, is not a good title. But there's no sense of glamorizing or glorifying what OCD is and what it does. And in fact, from my standpoint, the upside comes way before OCD even hits the scene. So I'm really interested in focusing on the person, not the disorder. And I think sometimes we combine those two easily and over-identify with them.
Say more about that. What does that mean?
Well, for those of you who know anybody with OCD or any kind of anxiety, right, there's a lot more nuance and depth to what that person brings to the table. Often they feel very strongly or can empathize very deeply. I say they start with really these profound sparks of feeling and these profound sparks of imagination, because if you have OCD, you also will go down all sorts of rabbit holes and thought spirals, thinking about every different permutation and combination, usually the worst case scenario, but that is the same roving, creative, curious mind that brought Darwin to his discoveries. You can't really separate the two, but living in the paradox, I think, is something that we can do.
I think any of us who are neurodivergent, we have to live in the paradox. If we don't, we face despair.
I will butcher this quote, but, Leonard Cohen, the great songwriter, said something, about hallelujah. And he said, when you can reconcile the kind of difficulties, the darkness and the light, that is the hallelujah. And so I think of OCD and the anxiety that surrounds people with OCD as a kind of intensification of the human condition. I jokingly call having OCD having a capacity for Shakespearean range, but not always having the tools to deal with Shakespearean experience.
So just so we're all on the same page, remind us what OCD is, what it looks like, and then the variety of ways it can show up for people.
OCD can manifest in all sorts of ways. And so breaking it down to, I think of the obsession part of it as the things that haunt us. And often those things can be, I'm haunted by a violent thought that I don't want to have. I'm haunted in thinking that this doorknob is contaminated and I might become contaminated. I'm haunted that I might have a disease of which I'm not aware of, that this thing is a tumor, right? All of the obsessive I'm haunted that I'm not with the right partner. Maybe I chose poorly. Maybe I chose wrong, right? Or any other thing that feels like I don't know if I am doing right and I might do wrong. And the compulsion is often the way in which we sort of try to magically deal with it. Well, if I do this other thing, it will make it all better. If I wash my hands, if I cancel this thought out, which I used to do when I was a little kid, I will clear this thought, this immoral or violent thought. I will say something or count to a certain thing to remove the problematic nature of that terrible thing. So any compulsion side of it is anything that we do to almost like self-medicate and make ourselves feel better. And it brings temporary relief. But usually the other thing is that we keep on having to work that magic again. And the magic seems to create a vicious spiral. And so, OCD can be really taxing in that you continue to go through this spiral of obsessions that haunt you and compulsions that seem to soothe you, but then become your own undoing.
What about OCD that is often mostly in the form of intrusive thoughts? Do you necessarily have compulsions to work those away?
Yeah, in a way. I mean, that's a little bit more subtle. But, it's funny. It's like, I think, if you think about it, we all have a touch of obsessionality in terms of, Camila Cabello talks about this, the musician. She talks about being a kid and having all the classic OCD symptoms, like, worrying about her parents, that if she didn't do this, they would be dead. Or at one point she talks about a sort of silly one from distance, that she didn't have her menstrual cycle and she thought that maybe she was the embodied Virgin Mary.
I know. I love that. It's so unbelievable, but yet so relatable.
So relatable. And so, but the other thing about obsessionality, which is part of the human condition, is we think and notice and ruminate about a lot. And people who just have those intrusive thoughts or just those pure obsessions, as they call them, well, there's also the unease at not being able to be flexible enough to put this as only one side of ourselves. I think one of the things that's brilliant about what we see more about anxiety is that it is a facet of ourselves, a dynamic facet of ourselves, but it is not all ourselves.
I was thinking as I was reading your book about a time in my life where I lost. It's funny. I mean, I work for myself, but if I had had a boss, if they had known how much time I was not tuned into work, my obsessionality showed up in my fear that my kids, who would be driving around with their nanny when they were really little, would get in an accident. And I was plagued by these worries that I was sitting there working in my home office and that my kids were out and about. And every time I heard a siren, I would spiral. And it just became so bad. And then I would say, well, I can't just check in on the nanny because she's driving. And so that's dangerous, right? Like what I want to do is I want to drop everything and call her and be like, are you okay? Please tell me that you're not, in a horrible accident. But of course I couldn't do that. And this would happen with my husband driving them too. And so I would sit there having this drama in my head. And these obsessions can show up when we want them to least. and absolutely suck us out of the present.
Yes, that's right. But you want to hear some consolation, Maura, in that situation. And Pablo Neruda, the great poet, said this too. He said in his wonderful poem, "We Are Many," of the many men who we are, I cannot settle on a single one, he says, because when he wants to be the hero, he is in fact the coward. When he hopes that he is the firefighter, it turns out that he is the arsonist. And in his poem, he eventually goes to say, like, this is not abnormal. This is being human. We have so many different sides. And the thing with having OCD anxiety is that you're tuned in to the fragility, the beauty of being connected and attached, and the possibility to lose it all at a moment's notice. So I jokingly say to clients, the wonderful thing about you and your OCD is that you are moved by things. And the challenging thing is you are moved by things.
Yes, and you notice everything.
You notice everything. And that's what they said about my son in his first preschool teacher-parent conference. They said, he's very smart and he's very cute, but he notices everything. And I thought, and he notices everything. Yes.
Your mother had OCD, and so do you.
Yes.
Is that thread purely genetic in your mind?
It's so funny to see the nature and nurture of it. I'm convinced that it's both, right? I'm convinced that it's both because I have my mom's temperament and her sensibility. My mom was a very sensitive social worker who was also very, very much enamored of literature. And she could talk about her clients and talk about the world as if they were characters of art. And she could notice things. So we grew up in Long Island. So like, let's say we were at a diner, she could notice the way the cadence of a conversation shifted without hearing the words, and notice where the emotions were moving in real time. And as a kid, she developed obsessive compulsive fears of worry that something devastatingly terrible could happen to her mother, that her mother would die. And I too developed a similar, almost exact fear at around the same age. So it's sort of interesting. Now, but we both also grew up with single mothers. So we were also tuned into the fact that this is the one show in town. And so I think it's this interesting combination of being aware by nature of these very precious, important things, but also being aware of the environment, that this is a reality. And also when you're not around people who can speak to we're going to talk about this later, the nuance of these experiences, you start to judge yourself and start to think you're not strong and not good in some way. And then you can't place these thoughts and feelings. And so they tend to snowball.
You say that it's a sensibility of sensitivity, but also that your OCD is working for you behind the scenes and doing your dirty work.
Isn't that funny?
How?
It's really weird, I think. But it's a sensibility of sensitivity. People with OCD, actually, there's some research that shows that people with OCD have higher levels of empathy. They can sort of measure it in multiple ways, and they even report having higher empathy compared to what are called healthy controls. And if anybody has worked with somebody as a colleague or even therapy with someone with OCD, they're amongst the kindest, loveliest people. They're very insightful and they're very warm. They can be very, very hard and not compassionate with themselves. It's almost like all of that empathy energy goes towards others, and there's not enough remaining to there's a wonderful poem by Derek Walcott where he says, sit down with yourself and feast of yourself. And I think people with OCD have a hard time staying with the goodness of themselves.
Yeah. A lot of my anxious achievers do too.
Yeah. I mean, it almost feels like you don't have enough. Sometimes I think there's a fear that this is a zero-sum game about empathy. And I think my take on it, really what I'm trying to provide that's new for people, is that actually it's really kind of healthy for people with OCD and anxiety to give themselves not only more self-compassion, but to trust in taking up a little bit more space, and that they won't become the bad thing that they fear, right? Sort of healthy ego, healthy authority. I think people who are sensitive get worried about authority because it might step on some toes. But there's a way of being creative and being able to notice this back and forth that can be really collaborative. And I once read, John Gottman, the great researcher and couples therapist, I remember he once cited some statistic. I'm going to butcher the numbers, but he said even securely attached children have mothers who miss the cue like over 50% of the time, which is like crazy. Like that's a lot. Like even good mothers, your good fathers do that. But the cool thing is it's not because they're really incapable. It's because people are really complex. And the other thing, it's because they also know how to repair it and make adjustments.
Okay, and the dirty work part?
So the dirty work is really interesting, that people with OCD often have a difficult time standing for themselves and creating their own healthy boundaries, right? A la everything that Nedra Glover Tawwab writes beautifully about, right? How do you stand in your boundaries in a healthy way? And so often I find that OCD will sneak up unconsciously to create boundaries. So for example, I once had a client who told me that she's having this obsession that she had brain damage. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. What made you, what led to that? And she told me, like, I said, when did it start? And she told me this interesting story about playfully talking with a colleague who happened to kind of like push her a little bit, but it felt like too much. But she felt like she couldn't say anything to this person. And then she started to go down a rabbit hole that maybe this was like harassment. It turns out she had a hard time just being a person saying, I didn't like that. Like anything that smacked of even a whiff of an aggressive move felt bad. And so I think the obsession came to say something that's really important to you is being harmed, and we need to listen to that. So, a lot of people, when they talk about OCD, they say, OCD is just a meaningless thing, and it's just a sort of tick of the mind that we need to kind of like learn to not listen to. I think OCD can have meaninglessness to it, but I think there's also a meaning and a method to it.
You wrote that OCD is both meaningless and meaningful.
This is the paradox, and this is the paradox of life. This is the paradox of being human. That life is coherent and meaningful, and it also can feel at times arbitrary and random, right? And the same thing, that the craziest, most wondrous thing about being human is that we will love these people in our lives so much, and we will lose them and ourselves. This is the Shakespearean center, and none of us are immune to that. But some of us, especially those who have OCD, notice it every moment.
We just feel too much.
Yes. Stephen Sondheim, the great musical theater guy, we're very proud of him. I went to Williams and he's a famous alum. He said, I like neurotic people. I'm neurotic myself and I like them. Everybody is troubled and nobody comes out unscathed, So I like to write about those things because I like friends who are troubled. When I can feel the trouble, I like it. I don't like people who conceal it. Because he says, every human being is really filled with anger and upset. And the fun of life is seeing how you can turn those things into good things. And I believe in writing about that. And to me, that's, I think, the mantra for people with anxiety and especially people with OCD is that you have this capacity to notice so much about all these inner workings of the psyche. And there's nothing quite wrong with that. There's nothing problematic. I think it's more problematic that we don't give it more airtime to use it creatively.
Well, one of the purposes of this show and hopefully of my work is to help people find the gifts and the things that are wrong with us and the things that everyone tells us are wrong with us. And so they are both incredibly meaningful and incredibly meaningless. Like anxiety sometimes is lying to you and sometimes it's showing you the way forward. It's both.
Well, even in that example, right? Anxiety was lying to you and saying this poor woman had brain damage. She didn't have brain damage. But it's so OCD performs this interesting magic trick. It distracts you while it's trying to focus you. So when I talked with her further about this, I said, listen, I can understand why you felt worried about being hurt and worried about something affecting something really important to you. And I think the OCD is actually, to borrow a phrase from Cheryl Paul, who writes about the wisdom of anxiety, it's a messenger here. And let's not shoot the messenger. but let's understand what the messenger is trying to say. And that's what I call upside magic.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
Because there's the magic that takes us to the downsides of OCD, right? Of going down the rabbit hole of now going on WebMD and seeing how I could have gotten brain damage and who else might cause me brain damage. And there's the creative side, which is, what was going on inside me and interpersonally that might have led to this place, which is difficult to be with. I like this person very much, but I also want to tell them no.
Forward thinkers know that when people thrive, organizations thrive. That's why you need a platform that paves the way for people to be at their best. Workday is your partner to unleash the full potential of your human and digital workforce. This is the future of work. This is Workday, the AI platform that elevates humans.
Brace the rudders! Raise the sails! Raise the sails!
Captain, an unidentified ship is approaching. Over.
Roger. Wait, is that an enterprise sales solution?
Reach sales professionals, not professional sailors. With LinkedIn ads, you can target the right people by industry, job title, and more. We'll even give you a $100 credit on your next campaign. Get started today at linkedin.com/marketer. Terms and conditions apply.
Is it overly reductionist to say also that there are very practical things we can channel OCD into at work? For example, that the very things that may get us into great distress in one situation can actually, when applied to things that we care about or things at work.
Completely. I was thinking of this the other night, and the weather was beautiful. And I was sitting outside at a restaurant overlooking the Hudson. And there was a woman. I was by myself. My wife and son weren't with me. So I was just people watching. And the waitress who was serving me was taking care of many different diners. And she was brilliant. She could sort of almost anticipate when somebody was about to change their order or when they were like, I think I will have that drink. And then she also noticed when they liked her sweater or something, she just had this easy way about her. But then I noticed throughout the night that she missed something with a couple who one of them might have had a gluten allergy. And I could tell that they were very upset. And I could tell that the waitress was also sort of upset. But she came over to me and I said to her, I just want to tell you something. You are very, very tuned in and you are extremely emotionally intelligent. And I've been watching how you've been taken care of. And she said, but I messed it up with that couple. I said, I know that. And I'm sure that bothers you and you're thinking about it. She's like, yeah, I was in the back. I was like, that's okay. That's part of this wonderful attribute that you have. And you know what? The other thing is I wanted to tell you, you were the only one working out here. You didn't have a lot of help.
Totally.
So I wanted to just let you know that you are capable, and sometimes people might forget that you also deserve support. And she, all of a sudden, her demeanor completely opened up because she didn't feel blamed for making a slight mistake. And she also felt that the fullness of her was seen, including this capacity to be able to notice what I call being a nuanced noticer. If you have OCD, if you have anxiety, often you're a nuanced noticer. And we live in a culture that doesn't like noticing nuance, likes to simplify nuance, right? So this is a great example of a simple work thing, right? I thought she was brilliant. And I was like watching her like I was watching a symphony being played. I was like, this is gorgeous. This is fantastic.
Yeah. I was thinking about my interview with you, and I was talking to a colleague yesterday, and and we were talking about it, and he said, it's funny. He's pretty classic ADHD and is definitely allergic to process and works with a partner who is so process oriented. And he said, I think she might have OCD because she's so worried that something is wrong or like a client product is off or a video isn't uploaded properly that she checks it like 1,000,000 times.
Yeah.
And it's kind of magical though, because I never worry with her that the details will go undone. And, with me, she's always worrying about me. I don't do my Slack. I don't do my timesheets. I don't do anything she wants me to. But they work so beautifully together. And then I was thinking we always joke people have OCD, but it is perhaps true that she is concerned that the client stuff isn't perfect and she's checking. And yet it's exactly what her business partner needs.
It's a great compliment, and I makes me think of another quick little business example. So I once had a client and he worked for a startup, right? But he was just starting out, so he was quite young. But the person who was his sort of manager, who had a lot of experience in IT and marketing, he thought, what am I going to provide? And one day the guy brought him in his office and said, listen, let's call him John. He said, John, I want to ask you a favor. I know I could tell that you can see everybody's personalities and their styles. And I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit about what you've picked up so far on how each person in this room works and what their strengths are and what their growing places are. He was surprised because the guy was right. He could pick up everything. And what was great is that this boss was not threatened at all. He found a way of saying, sort of like, I'm a music fan. So Duke Ellington was an amazing band leader. He was the maestro. And he would often hear the beautiful music in each of his individual players and then write songs that would feature them. And most people don't know his song, Take the A Train, was written by his young protege, Billy Strayhorn. But Ellington was secure enough, intelligent enough, emotionally intelligent enough to embrace that. I think he was really ahead of his time with that genius. And I think in this situation too, if this quality can really complement people who don't notice this stuff or are not as quick to put it together.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, where this also rubs up the wrong way is if you have, let's say, the classic movie or TV boss who's narcissistic, this can become a real sort of pissing contest, right? Because, the person who's narcissistic actually craves certainty, craves confidence, and also doesn't like to be shown that they don't have access to this sort of feeling realm. So it's really interesting, that this capacity can be really valuable, but it also takes a certain degree of humility and security.
You talk about the kind of interconnection between narcissists and OCD sufferers in the workplace. Do you think that they ever attract each other?
I think they often attract each other. I think they often attract each other in work, in relationships, because they each have a missing piece that's unconscious. The person with OCD, deep in his or her heart, would like to feel less doubting of themselves, right? In French, OCD is called the doubter's disease.
The doubter's disease, really?
Yeah, because they doubt so much. Like, you doubt your own perceptions. You doubt, is this clean? Is this really clean? Am I really okay? Am I really a good person, or am I a terrible mother, right? All of these things. And so a person with OCD is very, very attracted to someone who does not feel so harassed internally by doubt. And they're secretly admiring of people who are narcissistic because not only they don't seem to doubt, they don't doubt, right? And the person with narcissism is unconsciously, in my view, attracted to the person with OCD is because they're like, they that vulnerability, that capacity to have such a big heart is something that on some really underground level they're curious about, even though they probably are very defended against it.
You have me rethinking some of the relationships in my life.
Isn't that weird though? I never thought of it. And the thing that made me think about it, I have to give someone credit. Dr. Ramani, who's written so beautifully about narcissism and all its discontents. And I came up to her after a conference talk and told her about this book. And she's like, this is a very intriguing idea about OCD. And I said, it actually connects with your work, I think. She said, really? I said, yeah, I think people with OCD really easily fall in love with narcissists because they're looking for their own authority. And I think culturally, in time, and the thing about people with OCD also represent how easy it is to deal with noticing how much change there is in the world, right? People with OCD are sensitive to how easily things can change and that control can be easily lost. And what happens politically when things are changing too fast? Not only in America, but in other countries throughout the world and throughout history, we've always gravitated towards narcissists also to help us make sense of, wait, tell us that something is certain.
That's right. I gravitate towards people who have a lack of worry
Yeah.
because I have enough worrying for everyone in the world. And
Yeah.
it's such a relief to be with someone who's not burdened by all that worry.
Yes, but then I also think there are some people who have healthy ego. I once said to Dr. Aarons-Mele, I said, healthy narcissism. She said, no, don't do it. And I said, yes, you're right, because that can be a problem. But for example, Walt Whitman is someone who had a very healthy ego. And he said something brilliant about the human condition in Song of Myself, I think. He said, do I contradict myself? Very well then. I am large. I contain
multitudes. I say that to myself. I love that quote.
I love that quote. And, we all contain multitudes. It's not easy containing and expressing multitudes.
No, it's uncomfortable.
But that's the project of being fully human. I actually also think that's the project of American democracy, right? Of figuring out how to contain those multitudes, how to express those multitudes amicably, right? And I do think there is a way that all of us, again, I think the balancing act for OCD and anxiety and narcissism is it's good to have enough of a self and it's good to have enough of room for others. And if we can make more space for both and even convert the narcissists or the people who have less healthy egos to see the worthiness of having not only some humility, but of being taken care of.
Yep.
That living in that nuanced world is quite magical.
I want you to share some practical takeaways that listeners with OCD could take from your work that might help them specifically at work.
Yes. One thing that's really important, I call it finding your feeling. Find your feeling first. Or if you want to take an old acting kind of thing, let's try that scene one more time with feeling, right? In other words, most of us who have OCD or anxiety tend to use our minds first. Oh my gosh, like you said, we were both, Maura and I were stressing about where that quote was and that we wouldn't find it. Her because of her fears of dementia, and mine because I felt like I needed to be comprehensive. And I was like, oh my God, I've already failed this interview, right? And so I think, but the part is that when I was like, wait a minute, I'm feeling a little nervous about this interview. That's okay. I'm feeling excited about this interview, right? When I got back to, there's a mix, and I was like, it's okay. If we don't even remember it, we're going to be fine. So finding your feeling first is really important, right? People with OCD have extremely big hearts, but they lend out too much of those hearts to others. I want them to lend that same big, capable heart to themselves. And to trust those feelings, they're in the body. They're in your intuition. They're in your emotional sixth sense. And even if you feel something that you shouldn't be feeling, that's the point of what therapy does best. We can talk about what you're feeling and what you're not supposed to feel. Second.
Save that feeling for therapy, though, if you can.
Save that feeling for therapy. Save that feeling for processing internally. Save that feeling for your journal where you're like, I wasn't just feeling sad, I was also feeling angry. But I didn't feel like I could show that because this person has power over me, or this person might be offended because I know them. But I can make room for my process. I can make room for containing those multitudes, right? Second step is now, once you've dealt with the feeling, now let's go to the thoughts. Let's go to the mind, right? So as I said, people with OCD have an amazingly wild imagination. And so our role is to temper it and tame it and to notice nuance. Most people with OCD go to every possibility like, oh my God, I forgot this quote. Maura forgot this quote. We're going to screw it all up. But instead, let's notice nuance of, it's not easy to remember all these different things. Nuance brings us back to the messy mixture that is life. And sometimes it's okay to be like, boy, I feel prepared for this interview. Boy, I don't. For a moment, I feel not prepared. That's okay. And the more that we can embrace that paradox, the less we are consumed by it. And then, of course, so I think that's what I think made Charles Darwin so brilliant. He struggled with, from what I read, a lot of classic OCD symptoms like needing reassurance, worrying about the health of his children, a
Well,
lot of
he
doubt.
famously lost, though, one of his
He
favorites.
famously lost. Exactly. He lost his mother very, very young, right? And he lost his daughter
And
later
his daughter,
on.
yeah.
And so, but the other thing is the capacity to have what's, John Keats, the poet, called it negative capability, which is the capacity not to just use your reason, but to open up complexity in just following your experience. And that's a great, so I think it moves it away from the vicious circle to the virtuous circle. Is when we say, oh, wait, like, let's just use us. We're going to be therapy candidates for everybody right now, Maura. You ready? So both Maura and I were both sort of triggered a little bit in wanting to remember this quote, but then forgetting it. And then Maura's probably starting to like obsess a little bit about maybe that dementia thing is really happening and all those worries that come. And I was thinking, maybe I really don't know what I'm talking about, right? But then the more we're like, oh, isn't it interesting? I wonder why I didn't think about that part. Well, isn't it funny and ironic that it was meaningless? Right?
Well, except it's funny. Yeah. Is it meaningless?
Oh, that was such a joke, right? But the point is like, it was meaningless and totally meaningful. But
right.
The beauty is that it emerged when we gave it some space, that the nuance would take care of it in getting back to whatever nuance thing we were going to be engaging together in the moment.
Mm-hmm.
Whatever we needed from the past would come back. So there's an act of faith there that I think is lacking.
We were open and vulnerable with each other about it, though, as well.
That was huge.
Right.
That's
we didn't have
part.
to protect each other against, oh, God, I'm really feeling like, it's definitely because I have dementia and I'm not prepped for this interview. And Michael's going to feel like he's wasting his time because I'm not prepped and I can't remember his quote, and we're able to talk about it.
Exactly. And I think that's the other thing too. And that's another important point for people in this world is look to learn who your sensitive / anxious colleagues are, because we need a community of reminders, just like I did with that waitress.
Yep. Fellow travelers.
And also to be aware of how you explain it to people who might not get it. Right? Just like how introverts need to explain to extroverts how they work and why.
Yep.
Those of us with anxiety and higher sensitivity, OCD or otherwise, need to try to sometimes explain it to those who don't roll that way.
I do sometimes think it would be so nice to turn off my brain for a little bit and lend it to someone else so they could see.
Oh, isn't that lovely? I mean, I think that's why I really think of this as a poetic sensibility. It's hard to be an artist because you feel and think so deeply, but it's quite lovely too. And
but why, if you have OCD, are you an artist? Like, that feels a little romantic to me. Explain.
Oh,
that.
no. I think it's a great point. I think Kafka, let's say, was an artist, right? And I think he does a brilliant job of showcasing how an obsession could take hold and you could feel completely trapped in it.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That's what Kafkaesque is. And I still think somebody was asking me this today, do you have to have anxiety or OCD to be a creative? Not at all. No, but it just sensitizes you to being closer to it, or close to it, right? So in other words, you remember On the Road by Jack Kerouac? In one phrase in the book, he says, I want to be with the people who are sort of mad to talk and who burn, right? I think people with anxiety burn with a lot of fire as a result of all the friction of all these things. And I agree with you. I don't think it's good to get to the point where you're on fire. But I think it's good to be able to notice even the smallest spark.
I think I always say we run hot. We
run very hot.
We run hot. So to close this out, speaking of, you have a metaphor, you have a fire metaphor. Can you share with us how this fire metaphor explains where we see OCD treatment now and where you'd like to see it going in future?
Yeah. So I think you're right. And I think what you're talking about with the glamorization is that when anxiety is raging as a 5-alarm fire and it's burning down your house, there's nothing romantic in it whatsoever. And most of the time when people take about 14 to 17 years on average, according to research, to get proper OCD treatment, apparently, right? To me, they often get it when the house is already burning down.
Absolutely.
And I would really love for people to see and learn about how they can harness these sparks and use them and channel them. And I see that even with my own son, because he has a very deep, feelingful nature about him, very thoughtful nature about him. And I try to put into words that I notice he has this capacity to see the sparks. And so you're right. You're often very on, very reactive, very responsive. But I also think if you're responded to and that side is respected and honored and valued, there's something that could be quite lovely in it. And you can make it work without it causing you to be on fire. Then you can place that fire.
I think that the more time we spend fighting against whatever makes us different, the more angst and anxiety we create. And that, it's such a gift we could give our kids if we would teach them to love who they are and not fight so hard.
Yes, and then I think it's something that you said, which was so instructive for all of us. If we can allow ourselves to be who we are, just like Mr. Rogers might say to all children, right? Then whatever we are, whether we are deep feelers or deep thinkers or not, will allow itself to find creative purpose. And to me, because I think a person like look at Jack Antonoff, who talks about the music producer, who talks about his OCD.
Yes.
I think it's wonderful that him and Camila Cabello and Ali Reisman, the Olympian, could talk about her OCD, and John Green, the author. And like I said, Charles Darwin, Nikola Tesla had some stuff, Greta Thunberg. I think being able to talk about how these things can lead to the challenging parts, but also how these things can lead to those beauteous moments is really, really important. I think having more complex vocabulary about it is super important for us as a culture.
That's it for this episode of The Anxious Achiever. The show is produced and edited by Mary Dew, with production support and sound engineering by Nick Krinko. If you like what you heard, head to your favorite podcast app. Leave us a review. It really matters, and we appreciate the time and effort it takes. And if you don't subscribe or follow the show already, now's the time. And let us know what you'd like to hear more of. I get some of my best ideas from my listeners, so find me on LinkedIn, send me a message. You can find my weekly newsletter there as well. A big thanks to LinkedIn and all the listeners out there and our guests in the Anxious Achiever world. Until next time.